Today we're going to discuss a central aspect of the Brahmavihara practices, that is, practices of loving-kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. One of these central parts of this practice is understanding that these have what are called near enemies and far enemies. That is to say, the far enemies are things that they're really quite different from, and that shouldn't be difficult to understand, but the near enemies are critical that we understand. That all of these Brahmavihara practices of kindness and so on, there are ways of misunderstanding them, ways of doing them improperly, or at least coming to the wrong understanding of how we're supposed to approach them, that are known as their near enemies. And so we'll be looking at those today. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute. That's onlinedharma.org, where you can gain some deeper understanding, or roadmaps about early Buddhism, and if you have questions and want to know more. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. Each of these Brahmaviharas has states that are different from it, which it counteracts. And we can understand that pretty easily in certain cases. But it's also important to see that there are also states that are very similar to them, but which they also are opposed to. And if we're going to approach these properly, we have to understand both these near enemies and the far enemies. Now, the difference between near and far enemies is something that wasn't available in the early texts. In the early, we don't find this difference when we look at the early suttas of the Buddha. It seems to have arisen in the early post-canonical phase, somewhere after the composition of the earliest texts. We're not exactly sure where. I'm not exactly sure where or when this arose. However, it seems to have arisen in the Theravada in particular. Now, I would be interested if any of you can find evidence of this in the early Mahayana or other parts of early Buddhism. I shouldn't say the earliest form of Buddhism, but later forms, perhaps in the early centuries of the Common Era. The earliest I have been able to find it is in Buddhaghosa. Buddhaghosa is probably the most famous Theravada philosopher and interpreter and compiler of early texts. He lived in around the 5th century of the Common Era, so that's about 1,000 years after the Buddha died. This is quite a ways after early Buddhism. And we'll be looking today at material from Buddhaghosa's most famous book called the Visuddhimagga, The Path to Purification. And in this book, Buddhaghosa sets out this difference between near and far enemies. Now, the material, we have to understand that although this book was composed in the 5th century of the Common Era, Buddhaghosa relied upon earlier material to compose this book. So it's not as though he was intending to compose something new. He was instead intending to compile material that was available to him at the time into an easily digestible format. So almost certainly the material that we're going to be discussing today comes from centuries before that. How much earlier, I certainly don't know, and I don't know that anybody knows. Perhaps it comes from the early centuries of the Common Era, perhaps the 1st century, the 2nd century, or perhaps even goes before the Common Era. It's hard to tell. As I say, in the earliest texts, the texts of the Pali texts in which the Buddha's suttas themselves exist, we do find a discussion of how, for instance, loving-kindness counteracts ill will. That's something that seems relatively obvious to us, that you did a practice of loving-kindness in order to overcome, let's say, anger or hatred, ill will. But much more than that was not very well discussed in these early texts. So what we'll be doing today is looking at this later material. So we'll begin with the first of the Brahmaviharas, loving-kindness. Now, as I've just said, loving-kindness has the far enemy of ill will. That is to say, you can't have both loving-kindness and ill will in your mind at the same time. They counteract each other. Insofar as we feel kindness towards somebody, we can't at the same time have a feeling of ill will towards them. Now, there are going to be times in all of these cases where there is a sort of an in-between kind of state, where, let's say, we feel great anger towards some particular person, and yet we're trying to do a practice of kindness towards them. And we're not going to be in a position where we're going to be all one or all the other. But at least in the later period, in, let's say, the development of the Abhidharma, there came the idea, which I think has its roots in meditative awareness here, that what happens in those kinds of states is we have a kind of oscillation. We don't have both at the same time with respect to the same person, let's say. We don't both see them as kindly, in a kind light, and also with ill will, but rather these things tend to oscillate. We'll see them for a moment with sort of kindness, and then that will disintegrate and we'll have the ill will come up again. But the general idea here is, as we're practicing loving kindness, ill will tends to go away. So that's relatively straightforward. But what about the near enemy of loving kindness? Buddhaghosa says that the near enemy of loving kindness is greed. Is greed because both greed and loving kindness try to see the positive things. They're ways of looking at the good in other things or other people. And loving kindness looks at the good and holds it as something that we look towards kindly. Whereas greed, on the other hand, looks towards it and wants to possess it. That's the difference. And I think these two become very interrelated and almost impossible to distinguish from each other when it comes to, let's say, the love that we hold towards people close to us. Say sentimental partners, our wives or husbands, even our children at times, or our parents. We have both kinds of attachment to them. We have, obviously, the attachment of loving kindness, of kindness towards them. We feel we want the best for them. We see the good in them. But also, we have greed for them. We want them to do things for us. We want them to be there for us. We feel possessive towards them. They're our wife, our husband, our children, our family. And so this kind of greed then shades over into loving kindness and they become very difficult to separate. And indeed, many people, I think, nowadays will mistake one for the other in daily life by saying things like, it's impossible to love somebody without being attached to them, in the sense of this kind of greed, that this kind of greed is a form of love for many people. In the Buddhist understanding, they're different. Again, this is a near enemy of loving kindness. And I did an earlier video about this practice of non-attachment towards people close to us. I'll put a link to that down in the show notes if you want to see that later on, because this is a big topic. Now, second, the second Brahmavihara is the Brahmavihara of compassion. This is the second of these skillful or healthy emotional states that we should try to foster. And compassion has the far enemy of cruelty. So insofar as we're compassionate towards somebody, we're going to be incapable of feeling like we want to be cruel to them. And again, if we normally or naturally find ourselves wishing cruelty upon others, which oftentimes will happen when we're very angry towards somebody, we want them to be hurt in some sense, then this kind of practice of compassion can be used to counteract that. Now, that's the far enemy. What about the near enemy? The near enemy, Buddhaghosa says, is grief. He says grief based on the home life. And in the rest of these, I'll be glossing that as basically meaning mundane grief. That is to say, what he says is that the reason that grief is the near enemy is that both this kind of grief and compassion see failure. They look towards failure and feel sorrow for it and want it to be better. Compassion in early Buddhism is a wishing that things will get better. Whereas this kind of mundane grief is really kind of a wallowing in some kind of loss that we've had and wanting it to be better. We've let's say, lost our job and want that job back. We've lost something, perhaps our refrigerator has broken down and we want it to be back. And this kind of loss and wanting something to be better is a form of compassion, but not really. I mean, it's something it's a near enemy of compassion. And many people nowadays describe this, and this is not really something that I find in Buddhaghosa, but nevertheless, they will reinterpret this as pity. Pity being the near enemy of compassion. I think that makes, at least to me, a lot of sense, because the idea of pity is looking down on someone. Is that if we pity somebody who is in a bad state, has lost something, is hurting in some way, that is a form, let's say, of compassion in a sense, because it's wanting them to be better, but it's coming from a place where we see ourselves as better. We're holding ourselves above them. We're looking down on them from a place of relative security and well-being, and sort of looking down on them as lesser for having suffered something. And that, of course, is, I think, a perfect example of where we have a near enemy of compassion. Now, the third Brahmavihara is known as gladness or joy. That's the simple word that's used in Pali for these for the third Brahmavihara, is simple gladness or joy. Nowadays, we gloss this or reinterpret this as what's called sympathetic joy. That is to say, it's not simply joy of any kind, but it's joy in the happiness of others, in the success of others, which I think makes more sense of this particular Brahmavihara and the reason why it's something good to foster in ourselves. Now, what Buddhaghosa says is the far enemy of joy is discontent. And we can see that in a broader sense, obviously, because if we're joyful or glad, we're not going to be discontent. But I think it's more helpful to look at this as sympathetic joy, and the far enemy of sympathetic joy is discontent in other people's happiness, otherwise known as, let's say, jealousy or those kinds of feelings of not being contented with the happiness of other people because we want it for ourselves, or we want them down at our level, if you like. We're thinking of ourselves as too low or them as too high, and so we're discontented with another person's happiness. That's the far enemy of sympathetic joy. And again, in this case, you can't be both joyful in somebody else's success and discontented with their success at the same time. These counteract each other. And in particular, the practice counteracts the discontent. That's at least the hope. That's why we undertake these kinds of practices. Now, the near enemy of sympathetic joy is joy in ownership, joy in possession, joy in identification, because, as Buddhaghosa says, both of these states share in seeing success. So if we have sympathetic joy in another person, what we're seeing is their success. We're celebrating their success. We're feeling joy along with them while they're successful. But this near enemy of sympathetic joy is identifying with something because we like it, because we see it as good or successful, such as my sports team, or my country, or my family, my group of friends as opposed to those other people. And this kind of near enemy is essentially a setting up of a kind of a barrier, of saying, these are my people because we're successful, we're better than those guys. Or this is my team, this is my country, my whatever, my philosophy, my religion, my practice, which is better than yours. All of these ways of thinking are the near enemies of sympathetic joy. It's not really an issue of feeling joy in something else or somebody else, I should say something else or somebody else's success, but we're possessing it as our own as well. We're saying we're happy that so-and-so, such and such team won the championship because that makes me a better person. That puffs me up too. We won. The old expression when a team wins a championship, you don't say, if they're your team, you don't say they won the championship. We say we won the championship, as though all of us sitting in the stands or watching on television somehow won the championship too, as though we had all been on the field with them at the same time. It's this sharing in championship because we're better than somebody else. that again is the near enemy of sympathetic joy, and the sort of thing that again, like in the last case, and in many of these cases really, can seem to just blend together with sympathetic joy in certain circumstances, so we can't even hardly tell them apart. So we have to be careful when practicing sympathetic joy that we're not getting ourselves into that problem of simply having joy in people that we identify with, and thereby sort of adding to our own tendency to think of ourselves as better than those people, whoever those might be. Finally, the fourth Brahmavihara, equanimity, has the far enemies of what you might call greed and aversion, or greed and discontent. The idea being that if we're equanimous, if we're truly equanimous, then we have given up greed. We've given up wanting things in the external world, in some kind of emotional sense of wanting. We've given up discontent. We've given up any kind of feeling that things aren't right in an emotional sense. Now, we have to remember here that, well, we'll get to that in the next part, where we're talking about their near enemies. This is their far enemies. Their far enemies are, again, greed and discontent, or greed and any kind of feeling that things are not right emotionally. Now, the near enemy, however, of equanimity is what Buddhaghosa says is ignorance based on the home life. We might, in other words, say that the near enemy of equanimity here is a sort of ignorance, a mundane ignorance of the way things are, an unconcern, a disinterest with the external world. And he says that this is the reason why this is the near enemy is because both equanimity and this kind of mundane ignorance are indeed ignoring the faults and the benefits of things, but they do it in different ways. True equanimity, the equanimity which is the Brahmavihara, does not truly ignore the faults and benefits of things. It simply does not get emotionally attached to them. It sees them for what they are. It sees the faults for the faults. It sees the benefits for the benefits, but it is not emotionally moved by them, although this is perfectly compatible with our taking action to stop the faults and to pursue the benefits. It's simply to do so based on a wisdom rather than based on an egoistic craving for one and against the other. This is a subtle difference, but a critical difference. Now, the near enemy of equanimity is just this kind of, it's when we're still caught up in these kinds of cravings, simply to get away from them by ignoring everything, by being disinterested, by not caring, by simply being ignorant, by remaining ignorant. And I think we know that in some circumstances, many of us can get into this particular position thinking that we are being equanimous in doing so. And this can be indeed a form of what's called spiritual bypassing, and I did a video on that. I'll put down a link down below in the show notes. Spiritual bypassing is an example where we think we've gotten farther than we have. We mistake this kind of disinterest for equanimity. And again, disinterest is a near enemy of equanimity. It's something that we have to overcome in order to be truly equanimous. And I think to get to know all of this better, it would be helpful to look at the Brahmaviharas as practices themselves. And so I'll put a link up here on the screen to a playlist I have of the 4 Brahmaviharas so you can see in more detail, now that you understand their near and far enemies, what the practices are like. Thanks so much for all of you for being here, for watching, for subscribing, and I hope I'll catch you on the next video. And all of you, be well.